Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Spanish Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome to the Spain race ratings, the series taking a more chilled out look at the driver performances. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend, and also do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy and subscribe down below for more F1 content. Also let me know any thoughts or feedback in the comments. Now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. So for the result, Max Verstappen takes the win for the third race in a row, along with taking over the lead of the championship, backed up by Perez in second and then George Russell rounding out the podium. Behind them, Carlos Sainz, probably a little disappointed with fourth place, and then Lewis Hamilton in fifth, recovering a long way from the back of the pack on lap 1. No Charles Leclerc in there, power issues for his Ferrari. And then for the racing, for Spain, I actually think it was pretty good. There was a good mix of track action and strategy with some cars on 2 stops, some on 3, along with some battles going on largely and thanks to George Russell. There were some dull moments too, but I would say that at least in those there was something generally brewing, so I'm thinking of Sainz and Hamilton catching Bottas for example. The Russell and Red Bull battle was a great one to watch, and we did also come across some overtakes a little further back and throughout the field. So rating wise, I think I'm actually going to give it a 7. Definitely helped out by the mistake from Verstappen and the fact that his DRS wasn't working, but when I look back on it, did I enjoy watching? Yeah, I did. On to the teams, and I'll start with Williams, and just a disappointing race really, cementing themselves now as the team that's solidly in last place just on pace alone. For drivers, I'll start with Latifi, and what was surprisingly a good race for him. Started all but last thanks to Alonso's engine change, and while being at the back for the majority of the race, did finish and run ahead of Albon, also getting past Magnussen who was having a pretty terrible time. So yeah, for Latifi, rating wise it's probably a 6. I don't want to get too carried away, he was still almost 30 seconds off of Stroll ahead, but it was definitely a little more encouraging than what we've seen this season so far. And then on to Albon, who really had a miserable race, being beaten by Latifi pretty comfortably. I do believe he picked up some damage, which accounts for a bit of the time, but still he was a long way back by the end and had to make an extra stop as well due to really high tyre degradation. I don't know if we saw him once in the coverage, and I certainly don't have anything written down except wondering if he had an issue. So I think for Albon, it's still a 3.5. While I find it hard to believe it was all just down to him as the driver, he did finish last by quite a long way. Next up Haas, and again like Williams, fairly disappointing for them. But I would say that they probably played more of a part in that than Williams did. No real great strategy for either driver. I'll start with Magnussen, and other than the lap 1 incident with Hamilton, there's really not too much to talk about. With the collision, I think a racing incident is probably fair enough, but come the end of the race, much bigger consequences for Magnussen, who just sort of made his way around at the back from that point on. Not a great strategy as well, going soft, medium and hard. Rating wise, it is a little bit tricky, but I think it's probably a 4.5. Got himself involved in the lap 1 incident, which is never ideal. Then on to Schumacher, and a great starting position in P10, but just didn't really come together for him. Had a great opening lap, up a few places and into 6th place, but then was just overtaken by some cars behind, such as Bottas and Ocon. Wasn't helped by the team putting him on a 2-stop strategy, which meant he was then passed by Alonso and Tsunoda later on. So yeah, while I think the strategy really hasn't helped him, it still wasn't the most overly exciting drive. So for a rating, I'm going to go with the 5. I think as a whole it just felt fairly average to just a below average race. Next up Aston Martin, and we didn't really see too much of them. I think a good sign though is that over the last few races, Spain included, they're definitely distancing themselves from Williams at the back and more towards the midfield, which is good for them. On to drivers, and I'll start with Seb, and on the whole a pretty good race. Started 16th, finished 11th, just out of the points and sort of quietly crept up the order. Had a nice little battle with Alonso as well, which he did lose out eventually, but that was good to see. Made good use of the tyres he was on, and just on the whole drove a really solid race. So for Seb, a rating of, I think 7 is probably realistic. I think in order for him to be higher, he probably needed a point or 2, but still a good drive on the whole, definitely above average as a performance. Then Lance Stroll, and he had his race a little undone by a collision with Pierre Gasly, which was Gasly's fault, he got the penalty for that. Until that point, Stroll was running near enough to Vettel, wasn't majorly far back or anything, but that collision did sort of compromise on him on strategy as he had to box the next lap. From there onwards, fairly inconspicuous, not too much to say besides an overtake on Magnussen. So I think when it comes to a rating, I'm going to give him a 5.5. I don't think he particularly did anything wrong, but ultimately was just generally on par, if not behind Vettel, and I think on the whole just showed a fairly average performance. Then next up AlphaTauri, and really not too much to say for them as a whole. Point for Tsunoda, which they'll be pleased with, but generally they're looking towards that lower midfield. For drivers, I'll start with Tsunoda, and he got himself 10th and a point, as I just said. With my notes, I don't really have a ton besides a DRS overtake on Ricciardo and then getting past Mick Schumacher on lap 57. So on the whole, I think it's going to go down as just a fairly solid race and a decent result, which for a rating, I think I'll give him a 7.5. He was fairly comfortably ahead of his teammate all race and finished in the points when the AlphaTauri wasn't looking overly amazing. Then with Gasly on the other side of the garage, fairly disappointing I think you'd have to say. Only managed P14 after being demoted with a 5-second penalty for the Stroll collision, but even before that just didn't seem to quite have the pace of Tsunoda. The only thing I have written down for Gasly at all is that Stroll incident on lap 27. So for a rating, I think it's going to be a 4. On the whole, just quite inconspicuous, and just generally a little disappointing when it comes to both race pace and the result. Next up McLaren, and while a better result than Miami, still not quite where they'd want to be. A couple of points picked up, but definitely looking like they're in that midfield after 6 races. For drivers, I'll start with Ricciardo, who had generally a disappointing performance, I think. You know, he started in the top 10, but then was overtaken by his teammate and just sort of drifted backwards from there. I think if he'd managed to stay with Lando, it would have looked different, but by the end had Alonso, Tsunoda, and even Vettel between them. So yeah, rating-wise for Daniel, I'd say it'll be a 4.5. What I'd class as a generally below-average performance, no bad mistakes or anything like that, just off it pace-wise. Then with Norris, a little bit more encouraging on the other side of the garage. Started 11th, but moved forward to take 8th place and a few points, all while feeling pretty unwell throughout the weekend. Like a number of the midfield drivers, seemed fairly quiet with the coverage, but that's not always a bad thing. Looking back at the timings, seemed to be able to just hold a few seconds to the car behind on the whole, which then allowed him to comfortably take 8th-ish. So rating wise, definitely better than Daniel, probably a 6.5, maybe 7. Similar to someone like Vettel in a way, just generally a solid drive and a fairly good result at the end of it. You know, the only midfield cars to beat him were Valtteri Bottas and Ocon. Then on to Alpine, and a good result for them. Both cars picking up points and sort of solidifying their position in the midfield, just behind Alfa Romeo in 6th place. For drivers, I'll start with Ocon, and he's just had another very solid performance. Made up 3 places on lap 1, and then quickly passed Ricciardo and Schumacher, which helped put him in a position where he could just focus on the lap times and having good pace, which ultimately then resulted in him finishing 7th. He was never quite with Bottas and the cars ahead, but was definitely comfortably ahead of Norris and Alonso behind. So rating-wise for Ocon, I think it's worthy of an 8. Started well and then just built the performance from there, doing what he needed to do and picking up a good result. Next up Alonso, and a really great recovery. Started from last after taking a new engine, and like Ocon, just did all the right things at the right time. Was up 5 places on lap 1, and then came out ahead in his battle with Vettel. Even had a slow stop later in the race and still managed to finish in 9th. So on the whole, there really isn't too much to complain about. Pushed when he needed to, and just ran as best as realistically possible. So for Alonso, probably a 9. Another thing to consider is that he's had that performance with no safety cars or anything like that to help him out. Then moving to Alfa Romeo, and what is really becoming a team of 2 sides, which maybe is to be expected. Still, enough points to maintain 5th place, which I think they'll be happy with. For drivers, I'll start with Zhou, and given he completed 30 laps or so, I'm happy enough to give him a rating. Until he retired, was generally running around 13th to 15th, which isn't too great considering where Bottas is consistently running. So for Zhou, I think it'll be a 4.5. If he'd completed the whole race down there, may well have been a little bit lower, but there's only half the race to go off, and based on that, I'd say it was a little below average. Then on to Valtteri, and another really good drive. You know, he was running in 3rd place at one point. And I think in the last couple of races, we've seen performances that exactly sum him up, in the sense that when he's had clean air, he's had really good pace and driven well. But for me at least, left a little to be desired when it came to defending. The strategy wouldn't have helped being on a 2-stopper, but I'd have to say I'd have just liked to have seen even an attempt at defending. Still managed to come away with 6th place, and pace-wise was miles ahead of the rest of the midfield. I think for a rating, it's going to be an 8.5. As I mentioned, a little off for a lack of defending, but maybe that's just me. Was still a great performance on the whole. Next up, Ferrari, and bitter disappointment, what looked like a fairly easy win just didn't end up that way with power-related issues. I'll start with Leclerc, and he really did nothing wrong, maintained the lead into turn 1, and then before Verstappen's mistake was building a nice little gap. I think it was up to just over 2 seconds by lap 9. And then obviously the engine failure, not his fault, and took away what was looking like a very easy win. So for a rating, while he did nothing wrong while on track, I can't quite bring myself to give him like a 9 as he didn't complete the whole race. It's just hard to judge the whole performance that high. But I am still happy enough to give him an 8.5. You know, he wasn't gapping Verstappen by like a second a lap or anything crazy, and the 13-second lead he had when he retired was mainly due to Verstappen's mistake putting him behind Russell, than Leclerc being otherworldly. So yeah, an 8.5 for me I think is fair for what he did get to show. Then we have Sainz, and I think it's fair to say he did not have a great race, and that's probably something I find myself saying just a bit too often this year. Had a bad start, went into anti-stall, and then was down to 5th by the first corner. From there, made the mistake going off into the gravel, which just killed any chance of the win, and as it turned out, podium. I believe it was down to a gust of wind, but still, that's not really a full excuse. I'd say as well with the recovery, it was just a little underwhelming, especially if you compare to say like a Hamilton, who would have finished ahead if not for cooling issues. So rating wise for Sainz, it's probably a 4.5. You know, the bad start, big mistake by himself, and probably a sort of bare minimum recovery. I'm not sure if I'm just being harsh, but it kind of feels about right to me. I guess he did finish 4th in the end though. Then on to Mercedes, and I think for sure an encouraging result and weekend on the whole, definitely making steps in the right direction. For drivers, I'll start with Russell. I mean both drivers had a busy race. For George, started well, was up to 3rd and survived being tagged by Perez in the first corner, and then was really impressive holding Perez behind. You know, Checo didn't get past until halfway through the race. Also defended really well against Verstappen. Yes, the DRS wasn't working all the time, but when it was, George placed his car perfectly, was probably just on the right side of acceptable, at least to me, and then had the great battle with Verstappen where Max went up the inside, George went around the outside. That was a really great defence, a great move, and by the end, before having to cool the car, was a good 15 seconds up the road from Sainz and Hamilton. I think honestly for a rating, it's going to be a 9.5. Yes, the Ferraris took themselves out of it, but to hold up both the Red Bulls in the way that he did, while maintaining a big gap behind, was really impressive, even in the lead for a little bit of the race when Leclerc retired. And then Hamilton, who for a while it looked like he'd have a terrible race, but as it turned out, one of the best recovery drives I've seen for a while. So for the start, got away well but stayed in 6th, and then had the collision with Magnussen, which went down as a racing incident, which lap 1, I think that's fair. Having a look at the replays, Lewis is maybe half a wheel from the curb on the inside when there's contact, so I really don't think you can say that that's on him. Obviously, had to pit and sustain some damage as well, and when he came out on lap 2 was almost a minute off of the lead. From there, we didn't really see too much of his drive. I want to say he just took advantage of clean air when he had it and made the moves without being held up. You know, just utilising the DRS down the main straight. The other thing that makes it more impressive for me is that because he stopped on lap 1, it was effectively a 2-stopper going soft, medium, soft, which considering most people had made 3 stops, to also come from the back is a great drive, and would have been P4 had it not been for the cooling issues on the car. So for a rating, I'm going to give him a 9. It would be a 9.5 on the same level as George, but 2 things I tend to deduct is that, like Magnussen, while not his fault, still involved in a lap 1 collision, plus Lewis's suggestion to retire the car early, not the best look. But still, P5, arguably P4 pace-wise without issues, still a really quality performance. Finally Red Bull, and if the momentum was with them before Spain, it really is now, taking the lead of both championships and making it 3 wins in a row. For drivers, I'll start with Verstappen, and he takes the win, best result possible, but I don't think it was anywhere near some of the performances that we've seen so far this year. The big thing was the mistake into the gravel, which dropped him behind Perez and Russell, where he was just sort of stuck and couldn't get past. Obviously, the DRS issue isn't his fault, but on the occasions that he did have it, he still wasn't able to get the move done. Also, I kind of want to say he was helped by the team orders a bit, where Perez was told to move not once but twice for him. Once Red Bull realised he wasn't getting past Russell, pulled the undercut, which got him ahead, and then from there it was pretty plain sailing. Rating wise, I think it's going to be a 7.5, which may seem a little harsh, but he did make the gravel mistake, never really looked like he'd be challenging Leclerc before or after that, plus being let through twice, to me it's just not on the level of previous races, but still a good drive on the whole. Then Perez, and a really good drive from him. A good start, did tag Russell but no damage, which was fortunate. found himself stuck behind Russell for a bit, and then when he was really close was told to let Max have a go, and so just sort of had to sit behind. But then the team changed his strategy a little from Verstappen, and he made it work pretty well. Did eventually get past Russell before being told to let Max through again. So on the whole for Perez, I thought he drove really well, and picked up P2. Would have liked to at least been allowed to fight for the win, I'd imagine, but I still think Max would have taken it. Also, unlike his teammate, no mistakes. So I think for Perez, it's either an 8 or an 8.5. I'm going to go with the 8.5, not any higher though, as he was kind of stuck behind Russell, plus on raw pace, wasn't on the same level of Max or anything like that. So anyways, that rounds out the race ratings for the Spanish Grand Prix. I think a few really good performances, the Mercedes pair especially, so they stand out, plus an enjoyable race which, considering it's Spain, is always great news. Also, I did try to keep the length of the video down just a little bit, but it still ended up this long. Anyway, as I've mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed, and subscribe for more F1 content, along with leaving your thoughts, feedback, ratings and suggestions down in the comments below. Until next time, take care.